August 2019. Robert, Jeffrey, and Brian are high school dropouts that rob houses. The trio sell the items they steal from the houses for cash. And on August 1st, the trio gets some info on an apartment that has some important documents. If they can get these documents and turn them into the buyer, they will be paid a good amount. When the trio break into the apartment, they find the documents they need inside of a black zip-up bag. A few moments later, a teenager gets home from ditching school and confronts the three. Robert, Jeffrey, and Brian try and fight the team, but Brian ends up stabbing and killing the teenager. The trio leave, not knowing what to do after what Brian did. They leave the switchblade. About 15 to 20 minutes later, the police show up. Officers Mason and Jason Mazariegos make it to the crime scene and take the bloody switchblade that Brian left. The two young officers go and get some fingerprints off the switchblade. At the apartment, Robert has a flashback about his childhood. He remembers a time when he witnessed a homicide. On the other side of the city, Jeffrey goes to leave the documents under a car. This car is where Michael will pick up the documents and then turn them into the buyer for the money. At the same time, the police finish searching for the fingerprints on the switchblade. They're Brian's. Mason and his brother go to Brian's apartment to arrest him, but he's not there. At a park right next to the canal, Brian and Robert are picking up some firearms. The two put the firearms in Robert's backpack and start leaving the area. The two officers show up and have a shootout with the guys. Robert gets away, but Brian gets arrested. Robert goes back home to meet with Jeffrey. Robert goes to the bathroom and coughs up some blood into his hand. He remembers when this happened to him as a kid. Robert has tuberculosis, but it is not active. Robert and Jeffrey make a plan to meet with Michael the next morning and lay low at his place for a while. The two stay home for the day and get ready for the next morning. During this time, Mason is deployed overseas. Jason makes a deal with Brian. The deal is if Brian helps Jason arrest Robert and Jeffrey, he will get some time off his sentence in juvenile hall. Brian agrees. The next morning, Robert and Jeffrey try running away. They get confronted by Jason, who is armed and ready to arrest them both. Jeffrey and Jason get into a fist fight, giving Robert some time to run. Brian comes out from a hiding spot and confronts Robert. Jeffrey shows up and puts Brian in a headlock, not knowing what to do with him. Jason shows up and tells the guys they don't want to do this. Jeffrey knocks Brian out and shoots Jason in the shoulder. Jason falls back and shoots his pistol. The bullet flies and hits Robert in the stomach. Jeffrey drops his pistol and tends to Robert. After a moment, Jeffrey runs away, not having enough time to save his little brother. October 2019. While on his way to Michael's apartment, a shape starts following Jeffrey. The shape watches Jeffrey from afar while he walks to Michael's. After a moment, the shape attacks Jeffrey and kills him with a throat slash. Jeffrey wakes up. It was a nightmare. In a different part of town, Isabella is going for a jog. She stops by a creek and starts texting for a moment. She walks down towards the water but doesn't notice the shape until last moment. The shape chases her and slices her leg. He then slices her throat, making her bleed out. Isabella wakes up. It was a nightmare. Michael gets back home after being out. He gets inside and finds Jeffrey is nowhere to be found. He finds some money and a note from Jeffrey on the kitchen counter. After reading the note, Michael calls up his friend Jason. Isabella hangs out on a bench staring off at the bay. The shape shows up and watches her from afar. Isabella sees the shape and thinks it's her imagination. After a moment, she leaves. The shape turns out to be real. The shape stalks a young girl as she waits for a friend to meet with her. The shape attacks the girl and kills her. Isabella finds Jeffrey where Robert got shot. Jeffrey feels guilty about what happened to him and thinks it's his fault. Isabella asks Jeffrey where he's been, but Jeffrey can't speak and just hugs her. Isabella offers Jeffrey to stay with her at the apartment. Jeffrey hesitates to agree, but he does eventually. During this time, Michael gets a pistol from his friend Jason. Michael also starts trying to track Jeffrey's phone. The next morning, Jeffrey leaves Isabella's apartment. Isabella realizes Jeffrey's gone, but he left his backpack. Michael calls Isabella, telling her he knows where Jeffrey is. Isabella agrees to go meet with Michael and go get Jeffrey from the park. Jeffrey goes to the park and walks into one of the docks. He still feels guilty about what happened to Robert. Jeffrey takes out a switchblade so he can commit suicide. Isabella shows up and stops Jeffrey from killing himself. The shape comes out from a hiding spot and attacks Isabella. Jeffrey and the shape get into a small fight, but the shape slashes Jeffrey's stomach. Isabella runs away to the second dock and tries hiding. The shape finds her and throws her onto the ground. The shape gets shot 3 times and falls back onto the ground also. Michael runs up and helps Isabella. Isabella and Michael help Jeffrey up. Michael tells them to go to the front of the park and he will meet them there in a minute. He runs back to where the shape fell, but the shape is gone. A few weeks later, Brian is released on bail, and thanks to his dad's lawyer, he is charged with self-defense. At a local hospital, Robert has been in a coma for about 2 months. While at school, Isabella goes to the hiking trail. She puts on the ring that she found in her bedroom. After getting shot by Michael, the Shape took his jumpsuit and mask off. He had a bulletproof vest on when it happened, so he was able to survive the gunshots. Isabella and Jeffrey are leaving the apartment. They get on a bus heading to the public transportation center. Isabella and Jeffrey talk for a moment. Jeffrey leaves the switchblade with Isabella and lets her know he'll come back for it. After a few moments, Isabella and Jeffrey part ways. Isabella heads to a liquor store, but it ends up being closed. She looks inside for a moment, then starts walking down an alleyway. The Shape ends up being at the end of the alleyway. Isabella and the Shape get into a small fight, but the Shape knocks her out and then kidnaps her. A few hours later, officers Mason and Jason Mazariegos get a call about the kidnapping. They figure out that it was Isabella who got kidnapped. The two young officers go to her apartment and investigate for a moment, then leave, not finding her or any other person there. At the city cemetery, the Shape visits a grave. This grave belongs to a dead teenager named William. William is the Shape's cousin. The Shape wants to get revenge for his cousin's death. Isabella wakes up in the middle of the woods. She doesn't know where she is, so she starts walking uphill to get a better view. The Shape watches her from a few feet away. At Michael's apartment, Michael gets the Shape's mask out from under his bed. He's planning on turning the mask into the police so they can run it for fingerprints. At the same time, Jason is tracking Isabella's phone to find her location. The next morning, Mason gets a call from the liquor store owner that his security camera saw Isabella go into the alleyway. Mason goes to the alleyway and looks around for any clues to where Isabella has gone. He finds Isabella's switchblade. After Mason brings the switchblade into the station, he gets a call. He's being deployed overseas again. At the park, Jason goes to meet Michael. Michael told Jason to check the docks for any evidence that the Shape left. Jason finds the Shape's old worn-out jumpsuit. Michael shows up and gives Jason the mask. Isabella gets to the top of the hills. She tries to figure out where she is. The Shape runs up the hill quickly. He's gonna kill Isabella before the police can get him. Jason is tracking Isabella's phone. Her phone is in the Shape's pocket. Jason confronts the Shape and the two have a small scuffle. The Shape hits Jason in the stomach and then leaves the area quickly. Jason helps Isabella and gets her to safety. At the cemetery, the Shape visits William's grave again. He takes his mask off, mourning his cousin. After a moment, the Shape leaves quickly to run away. Now at the park, the Shape gets his backpack and gets ready to run away. He stops to check if everything is in the backpack and nothing has been stolen. Jason shows up to the park a few moments after. The two get into a small chase and fight. Jason eventually ends up shooting the Shape in the leg. The Shape limps over to the dock, not listening to Jason's orders to stop. Jason shoots the Shape again, this time in the stomach. The Shape falls onto the dock, not being able to move. The Shape removes his mask and throws himself into the water. After a few moments, the Shape stops moving in the water. Jason leaves the area and reports he found the Shape's body there already. That night, Robert leaves Michael's apartment. When Jeffrey gets there, Michael and him have an argument about where Robert went. Jeffrey goes outside to get some fresh air, but is confronted by an old friend named Henry. Henry asks Jeffrey to give him his money, but Jeffrey pretends to not know what he's talking about. Jeffrey and Henry get into a fight, which ends up with Henry beating Jeffrey up. After getting beat up by Henry, Jeffrey decides to go pay him a visit. Jeffrey and Henry make a deal to meet at Henry's apartment. Earlier that day, Henry's little brother Alan finds a pistol outside in the back of the apartment complex. Alan takes the pistol inside thinking it's a toy and hides it inside Henry's cabinet. Later, Jeffrey gets to the apartment thinking Henry is there already, but he's not. Alan invites Jeffrey inside, letting him know his brother will be back soon. Jeffrey goes to Henry's room and starts looking through his stuff. He finds the pistol in the cabinet. Jeffrey confronts Alan about the pistol. Alan tries grabbing it and saying he just found it outside. Recklessly, the two start pulling the pistol away from each other. Jeffrey accidentally pulls the trigger, sending a bullet into Alan's stomach. Alan collapses to the floor and starts bleeding out. Jeffrey doesn't know what to do, so he flees from the crime scene. A couple of minutes later, Henry gets home and finds his little brother Alan dead on the floor. About a week later, Henry makes a plan to get revenge on Jeffrey. Henry talks to his cousin Hector, and the two make a plan to take out Jeffrey and his friends. The two cousins meet one day and begin their plan. Hector gives Henry a pistol to do the job. Henry will take out Isabella, and Hector will take out Brian. On the other side of the city, Jeffrey tries calling Robert. Robert doesn't pick up his phone. Jeffrey leaves a message for Robert saying he's worried about him. Out in the woods somewhere, Hector texts Brian. He asks to meet with him in the woods so they can talk. Brian agrees and shows up. Hector and Brian get into a fistfight with Brian only barely surviving. At a public park, Henry goes to take out Isabella. Before Henry can even ask where Jeffrey is, Isabella walks away. Henry takes out his pistol from earlier and puts Isabella in a headlock. Isabella hits Henry with her lacrosse stick and runs away. Henry, not wanting to actually hurt her, takes his pistol and leaves the area quickly. Isabella goes home and shuts all the blinds, in fear that Henry followed her or is watching her. She gets her backpack and fills it up with some clothes and leaves the apartment quickly. Brian goes to an abandoned school, where he and Isabella used to hang out as kids. Not too long after he gets there, Isabella shows up. The two talk about their family for a moment and then embrace. Isabella and Brian are siblings. That night, Michael gets back from being out all day. He remembers the time when him and Jeffrey used to hang out as kids. On a random street, Henry and Hector meet back up. The two talk about what happened. Henry lies and says that there were too many people around when he and Isabella had their confrontation. Hector tells Henry to man up. Hector tells Henry to go talk to Michael and see if he knows where Jeffrey is. At Henry's apartment, Jeffrey waits by the parking lot. Henry shows up and confronts Jeffrey. The two get into a fist fight and Jeffrey beats Henry up. Henry lays on the floor for a moment, then starts to get back up on his feet. The next morning, Henry wakes up with bruises and cuts on his face, and he gets ready to go see Michael. Hector goes to take out Brian again. Hector tracks down where Brian lives and waits for him outside. Brian comes outside and sees Hector's truck parked across the street. Brian goes inside to get his stuff. Hector drives away. A bit later, Brian is walking down the street. He texts Michael telling him to meet him at a spot. Hector pulls up in his truck and shoots at Brian with an Uzi. Brian takes cover behind a truck and Hector takes off driving down the street. At Michael's apartment, Michael reads a note that Robert left for him. Michael burns the note in fear that Jeffrey will find out and accuse Michael of letting Robert go. After a moment, Michael gets Brian's text. Brian is running away from Hector down the street. Hector pulls up and chases Brian. The two eventually get to an abandoned park area. Hector and Brian run around and shoot at each other for a moment. Brian loses Hector for a bit and starts taking his gear out. Back at Michael's apartment, Jeffrey walks outside for some fresh air. Henry confronts Jeffrey and the two have a chase. They get into a fist fight up in the hills. Henry eventually puts Jeffrey in a headlock. Hector runs up towards an open area of the woods. Brian comes out of nowhere and drops Hector. Hector gets the upper hand and momentarily knocks Brian out. A pistol loads out of nowhere. It's Michael. Michael makes Hector get up off Brian. Hector backs up, then gets shot twice by Michael. Hector falls back onto the ground. Michael then wakes Brian up and the two leave the area quickly. Henry knocks Jeffrey out and drops him on the ground. He picks his backpack up then spits on Jeffrey. Henry leaves and goes to the top of the hill to see the view of the city. After a moment, he leaves the area. At the same time, Hector gets up off the ground slowly. He takes his hoodie off, revealing a bulletproof vest.